So basically, this glucose, has to enter into the rich family of glycogen. The glucose has to enter into the rich family of glucose of glycogen. So it has to be, activated. It has to show that yes, it has the power to enter into the rich family of glycogen. So this glucose, how does it activate? That is what I'm going to show you. The first step is this glucose will enter into the, muscle, into the, cell. In muscle we will have hexokinase, and in the liver we will have glucokinase. With these two enzymes, this glucose will be converted into glucose 6 phosphate. Again, this is not, only to glycogen synthesis. I have told you that this is the first step of either, glycolysis or HMP shunt, whatever. This is the entry of glucose into the cell. So this glucose 6 phosphate, now 6 is like it is having a, bomb, a phosphate in its arm. So how does it display power? It moves this bomb from the hand to the leg. Okay, anyone who can put crackers in beside their legs, they are more powerful. They are considered to be, more daring. So this glucose 6 phosphate is converting to glucose 1 phosphate. This is a very interesting enzyme. We'll talk about the what question is asked on this, enzyme in a while. So this is phosphoglucomutase, basically an isomerase which moves glucose 6 phosphate into glucose 1 phosphate. Magnesium is required for this phosphoglucomutase. Then what happens? This is still not enough. This glucose 1 phosphate will interact with another high energy rich molecule, and this in this case is UTP. We know UTP, GTP, ATP, all these are high rich energy molecules. And then what will happen? This glucose 1 phosphate will react with this UTP to form UDP glucose. Now this is basically called as the activated glucose. So this is how the glucose is basically activated. This is high energy form of glucose. Is this clear? So one of the very favorite question you're going to get in the examination is what is activated glucose? The correct answer will be UDP glucose. Is this clear? So glucose converted to glucose 6 phosphate, glucose 6 phosphate isomerized into glucose 1 phosphate. Now this glucose 1 phosphate picks up a high energy molecule to become activated, UTP, and it forms UDP glucose, which is the activated glucose. Now this activated glucose or high energy glucose is ready to get into the glycogen family. So let's look at how does it enter into the glycogen family. So basically, there is an already existing glycogen primer in your liver. This is already existing there. Okay. Then the first enzyme, that is glycogen synthase, comes into play. And what does glycogen synthase do? It will simply add the incoming glucose, glucose molecule by a 1,4 bond. By a 1,4 bond. 1,4 bond is whatever new glucose will be coming, it will be just putting one on the top of other, one on the top of other. Okay, so this is the function of glycogen synthase. So what it does, it will create 1,4 glycosidic bond. That's the function of glycogen synthase. Once around 10 to 12 residues of new glucose is added by glycogen synthase, then our next enzyme comes, and that is called as the branching enzyme. Now branching enzyme has two functions. Okay, consider it as it has a knife and it has a glue. Okay, so what does the knife do? Once 10 to 12 residues has been added, this knife will cut the 1,4 bond. This knife will cut the 1,4 bond, and what it will do, it will move this entire chain to a nearing chain by a 1,6 bond. Okay, so you see from here it has been cut, and here 1,6 bond or a branching point has been generated. So this is the function of your branching enzyme. So two functions of branching enzyme: one for glucosidase activity, which means it is cutting 1,4 bond, and 1,6 glycosidic activity, which means it is creating a 1,6 bond. So this is how it is. Again, what will happen? As new residues are coming, glycogen synthase will keep on adding here, keep on adding here, and branching enzyme will be keep it cut, keep cutting it, and you know creating a branching point. So this is how it happens, and ultimately what you have is a very branched structure of glycogen. Now, a very favorite question again asked in the question examination is why is the glycogen very branched, or what is the rationale that the body stores glucose in a branched way? So there are two reasons. The first and the most important is basically glycogen is a storage form. So if you just store linear glucose, okay, linear, so less amount of glucose can be packed into the cell. But a branch structure allows you to pack more amount of glucose in the same space. So that is number one. And second, if you had linear, so imagine if there was a linear A, only two glucose can be cut at one point because there is only two ends. Okay, now as many branches are there, okay, let's say there are 10 branches. So this glycogen, when we are going to look at the breakdown of glycogen, the glycogen phosphorylase can cut simultaneously at can act simultaneously on 8 or different number of branches and keep creating huge amount of glucose at the same time. So these are the two reasons why the glycogen has a branch structure, as a storage form of glucose. So this completes our glycogen synthesis. Let's now move forward and look at the glycogen breakdown. So when we talk about the glycogen breakdown, the first enzyme which acts is your glycogen phosphorylase. So what does your glycogen phosphorylase do? Glycogen phosphorylase simply cuts this 1,4 bond and forms glucose 1-phosphate. So it cuts the glucose, and before it's releasing the glucose, it will add a phosphate. Why does it add a phosphate? Because it does not want the glucose to escape the cell at this point of time. So that's why. So if pure glucose is formed, that glucose may escape the cell. So it wants to keep the glucose inside the cell. So what this glycogen phosphorylase does, it has 1,4 glucosidase activity, which means it will cut the 1,4 bond, and the moment free glucose is formed, it will add a phosphate, and that's how your glucose 1-phosphate will form. Then what happens? We know that glucose 6,1-phosphate is isomerized with the help of phosphoglucomutase to glucose 6-phosphate. Here is your next very important PG exam question. What is the enzyme which is common to both glucogen synthesis and glycogen breakdown? The correct answer is phosphoglucomutase. Phosphoglucomutase is the enzyme which is common to both glycogen synthesis and glycogen breakdown. So what happens? This glucose 1-phosphate is converted into glucose 6-phosphate. Then the last two steps are very simple, similar to gluconeogenesis, which we have learned, because this glucose 6-phosphate, if it has to be converted to glucose, it has to first translocate it to smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and for that you use glucose translocase, and in the smooth endoplasmic reticulum you will have glucose 6-phosphatase, which will convert this glucose 6-phosphate into free glucose. So this is how glycogen phosphorylase breaks down the glucose. And as we know that this enzyme is not present in the muscle, so that is why the end product of glycogen breakdown in muscle is glucose 6-phosphate. Is this clear? Right. Now, the problem with glycogen phosphorylase is, it can cut only up to the last 4 residues. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4. These 4 residues in any branch, these 4 residues in any branch will not be cut by glycogen phosphorylase. It cuts only more than the 4th residue. So what happens? Then our debranching enzyme comes into the picture. Our debranching enzyme comes into the picture. Again, the debranching enzyme has two functions. One, and here it will, have a basically it will cut 1,6,1,4 bond. So it will, so if these 4 residues are formed, so it will cut here. The last residue, it cannot cut a 1,6 bond. It will cut a 1,4 bond, and it will transfer this 3 to the nearest branching chain. So now what happens? Earlier, both of them were 4, so they could not be acted by glycogen phosphorylase. Now this has 7 now. So again, this can be cut by glycogen phosphorylase. What happens to this, the last branching point? So again, your debranching enzyme can cut this 1,6 bond now and form free glucose. Okay, so this is very important. Whenever a 1,4 bond is cut by glycogen phosphorylase, it will form glucose 1-phosphate. But whereas whenever a 1,6 bond is cut by your debranching enzyme, it will form free glucose. Is this clear? So this completes your entire breakdown of glycogen. Now this is the major pathway for glycogen breakdown. There is a minor pathway of glycogen breakdown which is very, very important in your neonates. Okay, not in us, in adults, but in neonates, this minor pathway is very, very important. Now, where does this minor pathway of glycogen breakdown takes place? It takes place in lysosome. What is the enzyme which is involved? The enzyme is acid maltase. And what does this acid maltase do? This acid maltase will take the glycogen and completely break into glucose. And as I've told you, this is very important in neonates. And if this enzyme is absent, okay, even though it's a minor pathway, if this enzyme acid maltase is absent, this glycogen which was taken to the lysosome will not be broken, and your glycogen will start depositing in your lysosome. So what you will have is a very unique disease, which is both a glycogen storage disorder and a lysosomal storage disorder. Glycogen storage disorder because glycogen is being stored, lysosomal storage disorder because the glycogen is being stored in the lysosome. That disease is, friend, my dear friend, called as Pompe's or type 2 glycogen storage disorder. So we'll learn about this glycogen storage disorder in detail, but remember, it is because of this acid maltase this disease happens. Okay, so this is the minor metabolic pathway. Once we have learned this minor metabolic pathway, let's move ahead and see how this balance of glycogen synthesis and glycogen breakdown is maintained in our body. How does our body decide that we have to synthesize glycogen, or we have to break down glycogen?